Nashville today. But we appreciate so much your thoughts and your prayers over this past week. One of the things that we began talking about last week is we started talking about leadership. Leadership is so important in the world around us. It's John Maxwell that says that everything rises and falls on leadership. And you know that from probably a sports perspective. You probably know that from a business perspective. We also know that from a church perspective. One of the statements that I've heard a lot over the past few years that I've been preaching has been everything revolves around the pulpit. That's not necessarily true. If we think of it that way, then honestly what we've done is we've given the preacher too much power. Because everything needs to evolve around the leadership of the church, which we know in the biblical model is going to be elders. It is going to be those shepherds. And when we talk about leadership, we talk about it in such a way that it's thoroughly needed today. Leadership is needed in a lot of aspects of life, from a worldwide just life perspective to a political perspective to a church perspective to a business perspective. We all need some leadership. So as we talk about these 12 weeks of leadership, I want to encourage you to think about how you are a leader in some aspect of your life. Last week we talked about how you can be a leader in Bible class, how you're a leader of your family, how you're a leader of children or even grandchildren, and how that's so important to the world that we see around us. So I thought what we would do today is we would take a look at the man known as Moses. Now we know a little bit about Moses' life. We know who Moses is. We know so many things about him, but to put those things in perspective from a leadership standpoint to at least this discussion is going to be pretty significant. And really, it's going to be pretty important. So if you're in Exodus chapter 3, I want to mention one verse before we get into that. Hey, Kip, can you bump me forward for a minute? I want to mention one of the verses in Exodus chapter 33. We'll come back to chapter 3 in a moment, but here's where we're going to go. First of all, we're going to talk about who Moses is, because that's really important from where we are as individuals. Then we're going to talk about Moses' story, where this story actually starts. Believe it or not, I said this a couple weeks ago, the Bible in and of itself is a book of stories. It's a book of salvation, but it's a book of stories, and the more we understand the people in the Bible and their story, the more that we can gain from it. So we're going to finish today with a simple question of what can we learn? But here's the verse I want you to remember. This is in Exodus 33. If you want to write this down, go back and look at it a little bit later. I think this is extremely important in the life of Moses. In Exodus 33 and verse 11, it says, Thus says the Lord, thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. The Lord, that's Jehovah. He spoke to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. How do you talk to your friends? You talk to your friends in a different way than you talk to acquaintances. Now, social media has changed the word friend. It's everybody's got a friend, all that. We're talking about really a close friend that you have a relationship with, that you have a connection with. It says the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man would speak to his friend. There's a relationship that's there. You can say things to a friend that you can't say to anybody else, because they understand your tone, they understand your nature, they understand who you are. I have, and I'll just share this personally, I have two friends that I talk to multiple times a day, and we go back and forth, and we say things to each other that if you were to catch a glimpse of that conversation, you would say to yourself, these guys are rude to each other. Because we get very detailed with each other. We challenge and we push and we shove each other in one direction. And if we do something that we think is not right, we're called out on it. Now you think about that. So if you caught a glimpse of that conversation, you may go, I'm not sure about that. Because what do? When we typically speak to other people that we're kind of acquaintances, sometimes we don't get into the details of things. The Lord and Moses had a relationship, or should I say Moses and the Lord had a relationship where they would speak face to face with one another as you would speak to a friend. They had a deep relationship which led Moses into many different ways. But one thing happens with Moses when we think about this relationship, and I want to caution you about some things. When we read of these people in the Bible like Moses and David and Samuel and Elijah and John the Baptist and Peter and Paul, and we think of all these big names in the Bible, sometimes we kind of pull back from it and we say, well, I could never do that. So let's understand some things about Moses. Number one, Moses was a person. He was literally a person. And what I mean by that is Moses was born, he lived, and he died. And being a person helps us to understand really who he was. I would encourage you to go look up the verse in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. Because you found out that Moses lived a really good life. Moses lived a great life. Now, were there ups and downs in that? Absolutely. But there were ups and downs in his life because Moses was a person. Moses lived a life just like we do. Moses had emotions. Moses had significance in his life. In fact, something else about Moses that is important to remember in this is that Moses was a Hebrew. Moses was born into the Hebrew nation. And as a Hebrew child, he was born at a very difficult time. I know a lot of times we reflect on what would happen if we were born at a different time, at a different place. There's a song that talks about an individual looking back at 40 years old, and he says, I was born 200 years too late. He thought he should have been born at an entirely different time. But here's Moses, born at this time into this Hebrew nation during a very crucial time. But that crucial time lended his abilities to God. See, in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11, this is one of those moments in Moses' life where he probably questioned what he did. But it gives us the status. It says, one day when Moses had grown up, he went out with his people. We'll talk about this context in a moment. He went out with his people. He looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He went out to find out what his people were doing. He went out to find out exactly who they were. And we all do this in some sort of significance. And we believe that we have what we may call our people. Now, once again, personal story. I remember driving down the road one day in South Carolina when we lived there. And I was driving down the road in this car. I passed this car and he sped up beside me. And he sped up beside me, and I could see him making all kinds of hand gestures. And I thought to myself, I probably shouldn't look because I may have just cut him off and didn't know it. But I'm pretty sure he's not a happy guy. And the more I kind of sped up to get by him, the more he sped up to get near me. Then he started honking his horn. And I thought to myself, I have never experienced road rage. But this is going to be Southern road rage. I don't know what they're going to do. Maybe they're going to throw a chocolate pie at me. I don't know what's going to happen. Now, this is not good. And I looked over at him, and I thought, I'm just going to look over for a minute. And I looked over for a minute, and he's holding up, while driving, if you think texting's bad, he's holding up a West Virginia hat. And he's pointing at it, and he's giving me a thumbs up, and he's giving me 2 thumbs up, and I was going, drive your car. Drive. And he's going, ah, and he's giving me all like the West Virginia stuff, and I could tell he's going, where are you from? And I'm like, drive your car. And we get up the road a little bit, and he gives me a thumbs up, and we do that. I told Carrie that day, and she said this, you West Virginia people are crazy. And I said, but here's the connection. He saw one sticker on my car, and what happened? He found that. Let me tell you a secret. If you're an Alabama fan, you do the same thing. If you're an Auburn fan, you do the same thing. If you're neither, you do the same thing. Because one reason we make a connection with other people, right? When we make that connection, we consider them, hey, this is our people. This is who we are. This is a little bit of us. Moses had that in his life, and the reason he had it because he was human. But he identified with his chosen group of people as the Hebrews. But here's the other thing about Moses. Knowing that he's human, Moses was very uncomfortable at times. And I think we need to understand this. I think we need to bring this a little bit to who we are. If you go to Exodus chapter 3, just look in verse 11 if you're already there. Verse 11, it says, Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He says, who am I? Now, go back to verse 10 just for a moment. We looked at verse 11, go back to verse 10. This is God saying, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you are going to bring my people out of Egypt. How uncomfortable did Moses get at that exact point in time? Now to you and I, we look at this as outsiders. And we would say to ourselves, he shouldn't be uncomfortable. God told him that he's going to do it, so therefore he should just do it. Well, Moses is human. He's a little bit uncomfortable. Go down to chapter 4 and verse 1. As God is speaking to Moses, he tells him at the end of chapter 3, in our Bibles with chapters and verses, he said, you're going to plunder the Egyptians. And Moses says in chapter 4, verse 1, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, but they're going to say, the Lord did not appear to you. Now, we think for a moment, and I've preached the lesson, and I've used this as well, that these are excuses of Moses not to lead the people. And I think that they are. But I also think that Moses is very uncomfortable. He's uncomfortable with the task that he has been given. Moses is to the point where a lot of people are in their life where they say this, and I've heard this probably more in the past 4 or 5 years than I ever have. Somebody says, well, I don't think I can do it. Well, my favorite question to say is this: I didn't ask if you could. Because in our brain, in our mind, what happens is we get very comfortable. And when we get very comfortable, sometimes we don't want to change. We're happy with the status quo. We're happy with exactly where we are. Now remember, Moses left Egypt, grew up in Egypt. He left Egypt because he killed an Egyptian. The people saw it. They asked him a question. He got scared, and he left Egypt. So now he's out shepherding a flock. He sees this burning bush. He's having a discussion, by the way, with a burning bush and with God, whose voice is there. And he says, I don't know what I'm going to say to them. I can't do this. Chapter 3, verse 11, who should I go? Or who am I to go? Chapter 4, verse 1, they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to me. Chapter 4 and verse 10, Moses says, oh Lord, I'm not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, I'm slow of speech and tongue. Moses is uncomfortable. Now, once again, looking at this, who's the greatest person to go back to Egypt to lead God's people out that's walking on the earth? Well, honestly, it's Moses. Why is it Moses? Moses grew up in the Egyptian culture. Moses knew their ways. Now, he's been gone for several decades. But Moses, he knows their ways. He knows their gods. He knows who they are. He also knows who his people is. There may still be the rumor that this is the guy that killed the Egyptians, so Moses is the person to go back. But Moses, in him, because of who he is, Moses is very uncomfortable. But here's the thing. And despite his humanity and who he was, despite the fact of his nationality, despite the fact of his uncomfortability, Moses was a God-led person. In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 5, a verse that we don't mention too much around the life of Moses, but it says, now Moses was faithful in all of God's house as a servant. The next verse is going to say that Christ was faithful as a son. But I want to talk about Moses. That Moses was faithful in all of God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were spoken later. Moses was faithful to God. We can talk about the leadership of Moses all that we want in leading 2-3 million people out of Egypt with God's power. But Moses was faithful to God in spite of everything that he'd been through. Now, he made some mistakes, but he was faithful to God as God's servant. My question to you is this. First question of the morning, and it's not in your outline, it's just something to ponder. As you think about who you are as a human, okay, as a person who's a child of God, because that is our spiritual nationality, as you think about being a child of God, as you think about the fact that sometimes that the things of God make us very uncomfortable, ask yourself the question, who's leading my life? Am I a God-led person like Moses? Because if you're not a God-led person, you have to begin there. You have to start there. That's going to be so important. But we ask ourselves the question, how did Moses get here? Now, because there's a premise, there's an understanding that many people say leaders are born, but I don't believe that. I think leaders are made. There are people who have the qualities of a leader. They may have the tendencies of a leader, but they don't choose that way. They don't choose that pattern. You see that in young people. You always have one that's just going to kind of be like the leader. They're going to be the influencer of the group. But where did this start off with Moses? Well, if you have your Bibles open, just for a moment, go back to what Gary read a moment ago in Hebrews chapter 11. Now, this is in Faith's Hall of Fame. This is in the passage where we read all of those names, and it says in verse 23, it says, by faith, Moses. What's significant about this is it says Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child. This is also echoed in Acts chapter 7, beginning about verse 20. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is giving the history of the Old Testament to the people and their rejection of the fathers. But he also mentions that Moses was hidden 3 months by his parents. When they saw that he was a beautiful child, they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, if you remember, they were killing Hebrew children. They were killing the Hebrew children because the Hebrews were getting too populous in Egypt. The Egyptians had a problem with that. As a result, they started killing the Hebrew children because the Hebrews to them were just very, very simple slaves. They were taking them and they were throwing them into the river. The Egyptians had some really interesting medical procedures to do all that, okay, to limit population growth. Pretty gory. We won't get into some of those, but they were taking the Hebrew children, throwing them into the river. They were killing them. They didn't want them around anymore. But Moses' parents said, not today. Not today. So notice what happens. It says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. You remember what happened? In the grand plan of God, Moses was taught by his parents. Moses was taught by his mother. Moses was involved in his family because, remember, they hid him in the reeds, in the bulrushes, in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter saw him. Pharaoh's daughter saw that he was a Hebrew child and kept him. Then Moses' sister runs up, has that discussion, and says, hey, I know the perfect family to watch that. That's a pretty good scheme. That's a pretty good plan. So Moses grew up, and he was able to hear all the things that happened. Because Moses was being taught who his people were, which enabled him to develop this relationship with God to later, so that he and God could talk as friends. They could talk as people who had a relationship together, because that began at the very beginning. If we want to see leaders continually grow within the church, we need to see that relationship, just like here in Hebrews chapter 11. We need that relationship to continually develop from the very beginning. And in that, we see that God had a plan for Moses. Now, I'm going to talk about these next 2 points, and I'm going to overlap them for a minute, because God had a plan for Moses. God's plan was that Moses, it says this, we looked at this passage in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, verse 10, where God says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you're going to bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. He says, this is my plan for you. He details the plan a little bit later when he tells Moses, you're going to take them to the promised land. You're going to get them there. But he tells Moses at the very beginning, this is my plan for you. This is what I want you to do. Now remember, Moses is minding his own business. He's just shepherding the flock, and God says, I've got a plan for you, Moses. And what's very interesting is Moses has that discussion we just looked at, that uncomfortable discussion where he argues with God. He debates with God. I can't do it. Who am I going to say sent me? They're not going to believe this at all. I can't talk. I'm not going to be able to do it. He's arguing with God because he hears God's plan, and that's very, very uncomfortable. But here's what we have to remember. Not only did God have a plan for Moses, but I want you to think about just for a moment, who was in God's plan? If you take a look at God's plan from beginning to end, who was in it? It was Moses. Now, I know you're going to say, well, okay, God has a plan for Moses, but Moses was in the plan? Absolutely. And here's the difference. If somebody, wherever you are in life, if somebody says, hey, I have a job for you, you know what that usually means? That means that they're going to give you a job, and they're going to step back, and they're going to have nothing to do. They just, here, you take this, and you just go with this for a second. You just go. And usually they step back. I want you to notice who was in God's plan. It was Moses, and here's how we know it. Look in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12 for a minute. This is after God says, I'm going to send you to Egypt to get the people out. Verse 11, Moses says, but who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the children? Then he says this, verse 12, he said, but I will be with you. God says, Moses, I've got a plan for your life, and I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving you. Did you ever think about that? When God shows him his plan, God says to him, I'm not leaving you. I've got a plan, and you're in it, and I'm going to be there with you. The Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews that God will never leave us nor forsake us. So he says in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, but I will be with you, and this will be a sign that I've sent you. When you have the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. He says, Moses, here's how you're going to know. When you do all that I've asked you to do, you're going to come back. You're going to serve God on this mountain, and you're going to know. You're going to know wholeheartedly that this is who I am, that I have been with you, and that I will be with you. Now, the question that we have to think about for a moment is the challenges of Moses. Moses, number one, has to believe wholeheartedly that God is going to be with him, because Moses is going to face some serious challenges. In fact, in Numbers chapter 11, I wish we had time to go through Numbers chapter 11 and Numbers chapter 12. But in Numbers chapter 11, you have the complaint of the people to Moses. They're bringing him all these complaints. His challenges is going to be people. His challenges are going to be how to deal with the people. What am I going to do? But you have to look at this. Who's with Moses? God. So let me ask question number 2 that's not on your outline. When we think about who's with us, do we know, not do we think, okay, understand where I'm coming from with this, not do we think, but do we know that God is with us? Or do we kind of say, well, I hope he's there? Do we know that God is with us? Do we know that in the challenges that we face, that God is with us? Do we know, have we gained the knowledge that where we are in our life, that God is with us? God told Moses, I'm going to send you and I'm going to be with you. And he gives him that sign. You remember the sign he gives him as they're talking about the burning bush, when he says to throw down your staff and it's going to become a snake and pick it up again? For a lot of people here, that's how you would know that God is with you, because you would have to pick it up. And a lot of us would throw it down and we'd run or we'd have a heart attack, but then God says pick it up. So he knows. Moses is able to see all of these things together. And if we had some time this morning, we would talk about all the people that were put into Moses' life at just the right moment. His brother Aaron, Joshua, his father-in-law Jethro. All of these people came into Moses' life not by coincidence, but by providence. Providence is God working through the laws of nature. And sometimes we say, it's a coincidence. We look back on it, we say, this is providence. Because Moses is able to go through these challenges because he has a relationship with God all the way from the very beginning. That's what pushed the leadership of Moses to an entirely different level. So just for a few minutes this morning, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what can we learn from Moses. I want to give you just about 4 things that you can learn from Moses. In any aspect of leadership in your life, I believe this truly fits into this. The first one is this. Biblical leadership begins with a strong foundation. What I mean by that is when we talk about elders and we talk about deacons and we talk about them, there's something in the Bible that's not there. And the reason it's not there is because I believe that God gave us common sense. Maybe some more than others, but God has given common sense. God has given us a mind of which we can think certain things. Did you really notice in the Bible it doesn't say that elders or deacons have to have common sense? Like, that's not the first qualification. It doesn't really say, now I'm going to say doesn't really, okay, we can tweak the words, doesn't really say, hey, listen, they have to be a Christian. Why doesn't it say that? Because we understand that they have to be. We understand the knowledge that's there, right? So we have that foundation that's there. We have this ability. But Bible leadership begins with a foundation of God. We know that. That's why it says that an elder needs to be faithful. Faithful to what? Not only faithful to himself, faithful to God. We know that the deacons, that they need to be faithful to what? Well, to God. This is where it's going to begin, and it's got to start with a proper foundation. Sometimes we kind of overlook this. I remember sitting down, actually happened in the past couple weeks. I was talking with somebody from a different location, and we were talking about the idea of Bible leadership and of elders and of deacons. And I like to ask the question a lot as to why. Why are and I ask weird questions so I can get away with it, I guess. I asked the question one day, I said, why do you have the elders that you have? And somebody said this, well, we just needed men to do it. I'm not really sure that's a good reason. I'm not, and that's a Chris Gallagher personal opinion. But the reason is, what's the foundation? Because in the Bible it tells us the elders are to be apt to teach. Is it easy to teach? No. What do you have to have? You have to have a good foundation. You have to have a good foundation to lead people. In fact, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through verse 26 again, you see Moses' foundation. If you look at Acts chapter 7 and verse 22, you see that Moses was knowledgeable in the things of the Egyptians, but he was also knowledgeable in the things of God. That's why he chose to be with his people. That's why he took the opportunity to go back and to lead his people, God's people, out of that. But it begins with a really strong foundation. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 11, there's no other foundation that can be laid than that of Christ Jesus. When we think about the example of leaders, when we think about the possibility of that, there's an understanding of Christ, there's an understanding of God, but it's got to be based upon the foundational principles, those that we all know, and it's got to be built on. We can't leave individuals on the foundation, because what happens next is it's got to be built on the right priorities. Without a good foundation, we cannot find the right priorities. In fact, look at this, just this really quick passage for a moment. In Exodus chapter 14, this is the children of Israel. This is the Hebrew nation, and they are leaving Egypt. Now, they've conquered Egypt. They've plundered Egypt. Now, once again, the people really haven't done a thing. They didn't form an army and go out and battle Egypt. They just kind of sat back and watched, if you will. They just kind of took everything in that God was doing to Egypt, that God was bringing forth into Egypt. They just kind of took that into play. And what happened is this: they leave Egypt. They take all the goods with them out of Egypt. They start marching to the Red Sea, and they get to the Red Sea. They've been joyous to the opportunity to leave Egypt to get to the Red Sea, because this, I want you to remember this is what they've prayed for. Remember that from the beginning of the book of Exodus? They have prayed for relief. So now they've been given relief. They get to the Red Sea, and here's what happens. Notice verse 10 of Exodus chapter 14. It says, when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? It is not that we said, is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. Do you remember at the beginning when Moses went there, the people got mad at Moses? You know why the people got mad? They got mad because the prayer was answered. But the prayer wasn't answered in the way they thought it was supposed to be answered. They wanted salvation. They wanted to be free from this oppression. And God sent Moses to show them the way, to show them the stair steps to it. And they didn't want to do that. They wanted the quick. They wanted basically God to come out of the sky, wipe the Egyptians, and move on. Kind of sounds like the Pharisees of the New Testament, doesn't it? They didn't want the stair-step process of seeing Jesus in all of his light, but instead they just wanted the Messiah to come down, wipe out Rome, and move on. See, people are the same. No matter time, no place, people are the same. We all have the same personalities. We just live in different times. So they start complaining. They start saying, it's your fault that we're out here. It's your fault that you led us here. It's your fault. What could Moses have done at that very moment? Moses could have simply given up. He could have walked away. He could have said, good for y'all, and he just could have left. But notice what Moses does. After they gripe at him, in verse 13, Moses says, fear not and stand firm. He says, stand still. He's telling them to be quiet. To be quiet. They're in ultimate panic mode. And do you know why? Because now they're uncomfortable. Because they've won, but they see the Egyptians. And it's just like a lot of people. You know, a lot of people talk about God answering prayers. A lot of people talk about God, I want you to do this. God, I want you to make my life better. I believe in an abundant life physically. God, I want you to be able to do that. I want an abundant life spiritually. God, give me a sign. Now, I know we're not supposed to talk like this in church, but God, give me a sign. And they come into service one day, and somebody walks up to them and says, hey, I need you to teach a Bible class. There's your sign. And they go, what we probably should start asking people is, instead of, hey, would you like to teach a Bible class? Or, hey, would you like to serve on the table? Or, hey, would you like to preach on a Sunday? Or, hey, would you like to help out with this at Congregate? We need to ask this. What opportunities have you been praying for lately? And when people are honest, they'll start telling you, I pray that God would use me more. We got the position for you. We got a responsibility that you can handle. And you know what 9 out of 10 people say? I'm not quite ready yet. Yes, you are. This is it. You prayed for the opportunity, and here it is. We've always said, hey, if you're going to pray to God for an opportunity, God's going to give it to you, so buckle up. You better be ready. And it better be your moment that you've got to walk through, and you've got to step through it. You got to be ready, right? But sometimes we get to the point where we just want to be God comfortable. God, I've obeyed your gospel. I'm coming on Sunday mornings. I might come on a Wednesday night. I might come on a Sunday night. God, I'm trying to live the best I can during the week. Just kind of let me be for a little bit. I want to get better, but just let me be. Because when they're presented with a challenge, they go into ultimate Christian spiritual panic mode. Oh no, what's going to happen? What are we going to do? And most of the time, what we need to do is this: re-examine our priorities. Notice what Moses tells them. He says, fear not, and he tells them this. He says, fear not, and he says, stand still, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord. Notice this, which he will work for you today. You need to stand still, and you need to watch, because God's going to do something. God's going to work. That's what he's telling them. He brings them back to the right priority. And notice this, he says, for the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. How did Moses know that? I'm always amazed by that statement. How did Moses know that? You know how Moses knew that? Because Moses knows God. And he knows that God is going to protect his people, that God is going to be there for his people. Because notice what the next verse says in verse 14. He says, the Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. Now that's specific to them. There are battles that we face each and every day. There's some battles that we pretty much have to remain silent. And it's hard to remain silent, isn't it? Because we're awkward with silence. See, that was kind of awkward right there, wasn't it? Because some of you had your heads down like you're paying attention, and you looked up, what's wrong? What's going on? Other people went, why is he not talking? Might go out again? What happened? See, because we're awkward with silence. Because in silence, we start to listen. And when we start to listen, we start to hear. We start to be reminded. I'm thankful for the words that Dennis brought to us this morning with remembrance. to be able to recall. And sometimes that silence is awkward. But Moses tells them, in all of your panic, look at your priorities. Stand still and watch God. Now, we're going to talk about the opportunities to move and the opportunities to work and the opportunities to continue, because what happens is if you have the right opportunity, then you fall into something else. And what you fall into next is extremely important. You start to fall into the right relationship with God. You start to fall into the right relationship with God, because biblical leaders will seek a relationship with God. Now you say to yourself, Chris, all Christians should seek a relationship with God. Absolutely. But biblical leaders are going to seek that deeper relationship, that relationship where you can talk to God as you talk to a friend, with honor and respect, okay? But the idea that you talk with God and you spend time talking to God about those things. When you think about the leadership profile of Jesus, at least 12 times in the New Testament, Jesus withdrew himself to pray, to spend quiet time, to spend prayerful time with God. You know, the question that I would ask, question number 3 of the unlisted questions in the worship bulletin is this: are you seeking a relationship with God? Do you seek that relationship? Leader or not, do you seek that relationship? If you desire to be a biblical leader, are you seeking that relationship with God? Once again, we take for granted the common sense thing. We take for granted the Christian thing, which are in there, by the way. God wants faithful Christians leading his people. But they have to seek that deeper relationship. That's why I'm so fascinated, and we'll go through these a little bit, of Joshua and Caleb. The amount of relationship that they had. When they go in the book of Numbers, we read the account, when they go into Canaan and they come back, they see the exact same thing the others saw. But the others get distracted, just like the children of Israel in Exodus 14. They get distracted with the visual and they forget about the spiritual. They get distracted with that. And they say, look at these cluster of grapes. We are as grasshoppers. We look to grass, we see ourselves as grasshoppers to these giants. And Caleb's the one that speaks up first, and he says, hey, let's go get them. Why did he say that? He's seen the power of God. Why did Joshua lead the people in the way that he did? He saw the power of God. We need biblical leadership that sees the power of God despite what the masses see. Because a lot of the masses, bring it New Testament words, a lot of the flock many times wants to remain comfortable instead of growing. We want to maintain instead of getting better. And we do this. We do it in so many aspects of life. The average American has only read a sort of an average, I'm going to say this, of 2 books a year since graduation of high school. Well, why? Because once we get a degree, high school, college, whatever, a lot of people just kind of stop learning, get focused on a job, and we don't learn, we don't grow anymore. We don't learn the weird. That's why it's so hard to change. That's why it's so hard when new things come out to change those. But we want to grow in some areas. Not many of us here are driving the same car that we drove in high school, because that kind of change was okay. We wanted to get a little bit better. But sometimes we ask the question, have we grown since baptism? Or have we just maintained? Something to think about because of the next one. The next one, at least, is found in a lot of different places as we see this from Bible leaders. But if you go back to Hebrews chapter 11 and just to look at Moses for a few moments as we talk about his foundations and as we talk about his desire, we talk about all those. But Moses saw something. I'm not sure exactly how Moses saw it, but I know that he saw it. It says in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 26, when Moses chose to suffer with his people instead of enjoying the passing pleasures of sin, It says he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking forward to the reward. Moses was looking forward to something better. He was looking forward to something that was going to be greater than any knowledge that he would have had in Egypt. He was looking forward to something greater that was going to be different than the things of this world. But he knew who his people were, and Moses knew who he was and whose he was.